Charity and Security Network webinar series.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
This session focuses on steps my organization can take to protect itself, featuring governance and program operations. We will be having more sessions in the coming months that will address additional issues, steps you can take to protect your organization in terms of finances. But also we will cover IRS audits, what you need to know to prevent one or respond to one, what to do if law enforcement comes knocking on your door at the office, permissible activities under U.S. law relating particularly to peace building and humanitarian development activities, and the Treasury terrorist listing and delisting process. We'll make sure that you get notices of these future sessions. These webinars are being recorded and will be posted on our website. So please keep this in mind when making comments or asking questions later in the session. At the end of the presentations, there will be instructions on how to ask questions. Just two quick disclaimers. The information presented here is not legal advice. It's intended to assist you on a practical level, but should not be substituted for consultations with your legal advisor. Similarly, as you will hear, U.S. law is both vague and broad, and there are no guarantees that any steps you take will protect you from targeted or discriminatory enforcement action. Generally, the U.S. enforcement policy has been not to bring action against legitimate organizations that operate responsibly and within the law. But there are, of course, no guarantees that that may not change. So now to our presentations. First, I will read the bios for both presenters now so that we can just go straight through their presentations when they speak. First, we're very pleased to have attorney Shari Crittendon from the Constitutional Law Center for Muslims in America. She also has served as General Counsel for the United Negro College Fund, which is the nation's largest minority education assistance organization, providing operating funds for member historically black colleges and universities, as well as scholarships for students in roughly 900 educational institutions. She spearheads CLCMA's nonprofit legal services division. The Law Center is an affiliate of the Muslim Legal Fund of America. Her experience managing governance, compliance, and other legal issues for UNCF and other organizations has been invaluable, and she has been providing training and assistance to Muslim organizations in the U.S. Next is Julien Schopp, Director of Humanitarian Practice and Interaction. He supports humanitarian emergency responses and contributes to improvement of humanitarian practice on behalf of the network members. This involves representing Interaction on the IASC Emergency Directors Group and the Sphere Board. So he's been very involved in improving partnerships with UN agencies, overseeing country-specific working groups, and facilitating development of clear advocacy positions on major humanitarian issues. Before that, he was Senior Policy Officer for the International Council of Voluntary Agencies, and also has substantial field experience managing humanitarian operations with the International Rescue Committee and other organizations. So with that, I will turn it over to Shari, who will provide us with information on steps you can take in the field of governance. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Shari Crittendon, as Kay introduced, and I wanted to talk a little bit about what actions have occurred in the Trump administration that could impact or affect nonprofits. But first, I wanted to level set a little bit. One, looking at the philosophy, the philanthropy philosophy. Under the last two administrations, under President George W. Bush and the Obama administration, there was the White House Office of Faith-Based and Community Initiatives. And under this, the administration has pushed millions of dollars working collaboratively and in a bipartisan manner with top foundations and nonprofits. So It's still unclear whether under this administration, based on the president's personal individual giving, if this relationship with the nonprofit community will still continue. Based on some of the actions that have taken place in the last 76 days, it appears that the administration is really more focused and aligned with the for-profit sector and views their success really as the vehicle to strengthen the civil society. So before I talk specifically about the areas where I think the Trump administrative actions will impact nonprofits, I really want to, again, level set, and as Kay said, I want to reaffirm, when you operate responsibly and within the law, you should be okay. So what I share is continue to act like a tax-exempt or a nonprofit organization. Remain or become compliant with the federal laws. And I won't focus on them all here because I do want the bulk of my conversation to deal with responses to some of the Trump actions. But make sure you have a competent, informed, and engaged board. Make sure that you continue to operate for your exempt purpose if you have a tax exemption. I want to note here that nonprofit law is a state term. Tax exemption is a federal one. So if you filed your Form 1023 and you have your exemption, then these are the things that you have to do, the filing, the not operating for your own personal financial benefit in the activities. Make sure you limit your lobbying. If you're a religious organization, there's restrictions on lobbying at all, although there can be issue advocacy. You can endorse or get involved in political campaigns. If you have activities where you have revenue from businesses unrelated to your exempt purpose, try to limit that. And then not engaging in activities that violate public policy. The next thing I wanted to talk about is the same thing with the state. You should look in the jurisdiction where you're incorporated, where you operate, where you do business to ensure that you're properly incorporated, that you've registered with the Secretary of State, and that you've also registered to solicit charitable donations in all the jurisdictions where you may solicit. And if you solicit online through the internet, that could be all of the 39 plus the District of Columbia. Financial oversight and internal controls. Again, act like a tax-exempt or a nonprofit organization. Keep extensive documentation. If you want to protect your organization and your directors from any personal liability, it's really extremely important that you document. You document the actions that you took. You have the proper policies and procedures in place, and that you keep your minutes, your resolutions intact, and you should keep those in perpetuity. And again, making sure that your organization is using its resources for which its specific mission. And again, the tone is set from the top, so it's important that your board of directors are informed. So let's get and talk about what's happening in the last 76 days. Believe it or not, there's been 29, at least I counted last night, executive orders and since the president has taken office. Based on the campaign promises, executive orders, budget proposals, the first 100 days priorities, we can glean, although still uncertain, where the president is going as far as his priorities. And so my conversation is briefly going to talk about what are some of the areas which the president is going to focus on. The first one is immigration. And as we know, well, I'll go on. The second one is tax reform, deregulation with the Affordable Care Act and with the Johnson Amendment, international charitable activities, OFAC, Office of Foreign Asset Control. I'll talk briefly about that. And then donor risk, knowing your donor. So for immigration, the executive order, as we know, called the Muslim ban, the first executive order and even the second one, it created chaos for everyone. But specifically for those who held green cards or those visa holders under the H-1B worker program. Courts currently have enforced the stay. I believe the current status is the judge in Hawaii says we're going to stay it. There's an injunction. I'm sure the administration is going to come back to that to figure out how they can get around or find something that doesn't violate constitutional rights of its citizens. So what can you do? On the immigration front, one, if you're an employer, make sure that you're compliant with the I-9, employment verification, to ensure that your employees are authorized to work in the U.S. You're also going to have a higher level of scrutiny. So constructing an argument, a very strong and persuasive argument on why you need this worker for an H-1B visa. Conduct background checks on your employees, especially employees that are dealing with money of vulnerable persons. And vulnerable persons are children or elderly or those who may have some type of disability. Forms of immigration relief, again, it's chaotic. They drastically change and with very little notice. So it's important, I believe, to build your networks of support, mobilize your youth, create avenues for funding for these specific purposes. And as being an attorney, I always say, always work closely with an immigration attorney, not just an attorney that does a variety of things, someone who specializes in immigration law. Tax reform. Administration vows to cut taxes on the middle class. So the argument is, okay, great. We're going to see a surge in donations, right? And especially before any implementation of new tax policies. We've seen that in the past under the Bush administration. You can look at the ACLU. There have been increase in membership as well as in funding for the ACLU since the president took office. But there's also potentially harmful issues in the tax reform bill. One is considered the standard deduction, and the other one is a cap on the amount a donor can write off. So if you have a standard deduction, the argument is perhaps that citizens and those who donate to nonprofits won't donate as much because there's a standard deduction, so they can't increase that. The other thing is also if there's a cap on the amount a donor can write off, again, it might chill the effect of donors wanting to give more to nonprofits. And if there's less tax revenue coming into the government, then there's less government funding. We've seen already that Planned Parenthood is being defunded unless they stop some of their practices. So if you have steep cuts, and if you look at the president's budget proposal, where there's cuts to things that nonprofits do, art, education, food, housing, workforce and economic development, healthcare, disease prevention, and it goes on. This could create a drain on the nonprofits because now nonprofits are going to have to look to step in to fill and supplement some of those funding gaps where the government before had. So what actions can you take here? My argument here is you need to rebrand your fundraising strategy to target, if you haven't already, those donors who may feel incentivized to give more because they have a less of a tax break. I also would look to seek funding from corporate or family foundations. Many of these see faith-based foundations or community-based nonprofits as vehicles now to support worthy causes. And lastly, I would say is go ahead and review your annual budget. You're going to have to change on how you think about making strategic investments in your fundraising and development. You may need to now increase the development offices you have. If you do, change your strategy on, again, who are the donors that you're going after, again, with the changes that may happen in the tax bill. And again, these are all proposals. We're not sure, but you want to be proactive as you can. Deregulation. So the first thing is the repeal and replace of the Affordable Care Act, also affectionately known as Obamacare. And as we know, the Republican Party, since it was passed, has vowed to destroy it, to get rid of it. There were efforts made in the first 30 days. I think that was the first EO executive order that President Trump signed into effect. And fortunately, the bill was failed in Congress. Now, there are some rumblings that it's going to be repackaged and it's going to be submitted again. But again, there's still uncertainty. The other one is the Johnson Amendment. And this is after the former president, and at the time he was the Senator Minority Leader, Lyndon Baines Johnson. And it was in 1954. Trump has vowed to get rid of it and again totally destroy the provision. And this provision basically is saying religious organizations, we do not want them engaging in partisan politics. Nonprofits, we don't want them engaging in partisan politics. So by eliminating the Johnson Amendment and allowing exempt organizations to participate in political campaigns, donors would essentially be able to deduct the cost of funding political campaigns versus focusing on solving issues in the community. Now, the response may be, this is great, right? Because now we're going to get all of this money coming in where before we could not. So in addition to the super PACs funding, the political parties could see unrestricted dollars funneling in for national or even local or religious organizations. Yes, that could be the outcome of that, but then that also means you're going to be under more scrutiny. Who are your donors? And trying to unmask to see who are some of these anonymous donors. Do you want your records now to be submitted to the government for review? Think about that. The other piece on the Affordable Care Act is nothing has changed. There has been some relaxation on the compliance forms, but those are still due, and they're due in January, March quarterly. So if you are an employer, these forms, you're still expected to comply with the Affordable Care Act. International charitable activities, and this is primarily dealing with OFAC. And I won't spend a lot of time on this here. As Kay mentioned, I work for the Constitutional Law Center for Muslims in America. We have regional legal clinics and presentations. Our next one is going to be in Baltimore on the 13th or the 14th of April through the 16th. And we do a deeper dive. But what I wanted to mention here is OFAC is still around. IEPA is still around. And these are sanctions that the government employs for persons who are deemed to be terrorists, deemed to be enemy combatants. There are regions of the country that Sudan, Cuba, Iran, that's specifically on the list. This was promulgated by executive order, and the International Emergency Economics Powers Act for IEPA. And as you can see here, those who committed acts of terrorism, those suspected, those threatened to commit acts of terrorism. And what has happened here, those who have been sanctioned under this regulation is that they have had their property seized, their assets frozen, and they haven't had an opportunity to defend themselves as a result of that. And so what are some actions that you can take immediately? And these are some of the recommendations that myself and other attorneys here at the firm have made. Protect your essential documents. I talked earlier about behaving like a nonprofit. One of the things you should do in behaving like a nonprofit is document, yes, but you also protect your essential documents. So you should have redundancies of minutes, of resolutions, of bank statements, of annual reports. Make copies of every document that is essential to defend your organization. Financial records, tax filings that I mentioned. And I would recommend that these, again, important documents, you can give them to your outside counsel to have. So in case you're concerned that you could be a target not only of the government, but some other domestic litigation, this would be important for you to have these documents to present and to use in your defense. Other actions that you can take to defend yourself is consider other alternatives when you are donating or receiving funds. And I'm going to talk about donor risk in a minute. But consider making a grant to a nonprofit that operates internationally. Have the funding maybe be for short term, a beginning and an ending for a specific issue. Working through other nonprofits, government agencies like USAID, CARE, Save the Children. But if you are going to send money overseas, especially to countries like Syria or the Sudan or other countries that may be on some watch list or may be under scrutiny, make sure that if you work with a contractor that you've probably vetted the contractor. You know who this person is. You understand their reputation. They've worked with other charities before to success. So all the due diligence that you should perform on anyone that you interact with, you especially should heighten these. And OFAC has just published a list of activities, risk factors for charities dispersing funds or resources to grantees that are out of the country. And they categorize these in low risk, medium risk, high risk. If you go to their website, they have that risk matrix. If you email me, I can also share that with you. Lastly, I want to talk about donor risk, and this is domestic or international. These are, as I mentioned here, these are some of the issues that come with donor risk. And these are, again, if you are faith-based, if you deal overseas, you may be more heightened scrutiny by the government than others. So fraudulent conveyances, making sure what the gift that you're given is actually the thing that you're free to. Making sure that the gift is consistent with the nonprofit mission. So if it shouldn't be inconsistent, so if your mission is to help fund education, then you shouldn't be engaged in something that would detract from that. Make sure you know your donor. What happens if you have a donor that comes in anonymous December 31st, they have no references, no documents to understand what the source of the funds, and say, I really need to give this $1 million, I want the tax break. You should pause there for a minute and understand who is this person again, what their reputation is, why are they giving. Embarrassing donor. They're fine today, but next week they could be designated as an enemy combatant. Next week, they could be arrested for child molestation. There have been cases, if you look at the Trump Foundation as well as the Clinton Foundation and others, look up the name Jeffrey Epstein. Harvard has had to give back donations to the UAE. So make sure that you do the best you can, making a meaningful attempt to understand the donors, and a way to do some of that is to one, and I'll move to the next slide, is to have a gift acceptance policy. We talk about policies that are important, and these other steps here are important. Confidentiality agreements, again, I mentioned the donor due diligence, but the gift acceptance policy. If your organization sets out, one, who can accept a gift, the type of gift, then that will, again, show good faith evidence, even if you have an embarrassing donor a year or two later, that at the time that you accepted the gift, it was within your policy and you adhered to that. Also having a gift agreement. And in the gift agreement, you should have, we can terminate a morals clause, if you, what they call a variance power, if you can no longer adhere to what the intent of the gift was. For example, there was a case in Baltimore where an entity had said, you can build this building, but the activities are only for whites. Now, this was back in the 60s. In the 90s, there was a lawsuit to say you can't have these programs only for whites. So at the time they accepted it, unfortunately, in the government and the policies, it was okay. But they went back to court and they asked the court to say, can we use these funds now for something else that's related to our mission? So those are some of the things that you can do in order to protect yourself. And the other piece is, we talk about this, there should be insurance and indemnification, as well as D&O insurance to ensure that you're protecting your officers. And the other piece that we talk about often is charity-owned limited liability companies. And this, you may need outside counsel to help. But what a charity-owned limited liability company is similar to a corporation. So when you form what we call a single-member LLC, a limited liability company, the charity is the sole member, and it's a separate corporation. Liability protections that come with LLCs can shield or insulate you from liability, and it insulates the officers as well as the tax-exempt organization that might want to engage in what could be considered a risky venture. So if you want to hold property, if you want to accept certain donations, this is a way that if you adhere to the corporate formalities, the LLC will protect the charity's other assets, And it will also limit the risk the charity by entering into those agreements directly. For tax purposes, a single member LLC is considered a disregarded entity. So that means you don't have to file a tax return. And I'll go to the next page where I line all this out. You don't have to file a tax return because the only member is a tax-exempt entity. You may have to elect to have a separate tax status if you'd like. The only issue with the LLC, the single member LLC, is unsettled whether a donor who contributes to an LLC can receive a tax deduction. The IRS has not opined on that as of yet. But this is another way to protect the assets of your nonprofit while being able to enter into other activities that may consider risky, but that could be beneficial overall to the organization. So lastly, what I want to say is, as a lawyer and CLCMA, the Constitutional Law Center, we're not an advocacy organization. We're a law firm. However, advocate is very important. So it's not only how do you protect yourself, it's what proactive actions can you take. And one is be an advocate, be informed, collaborate across other identity groups with other groups that are different than you, but have the same issue, different causes, different faiths, different fields or industries. Also, continue to engage and inform your constituents. Sometimes your constituents have a lot of information that can be very supportive and helpful as you navigate through this. Also, seek expertise. Again, as I mentioned, if you have an immigration issue, deal with the immigration attorney. Talk to lawyers. I am finding that really sharp counsel, major firms are willing to speak with you, share their expertise at a pro bono or very reduced rate. So if you need a CPA or an accountant, please use those experts, because that's also how you protect yourself, to say, look, I hired a third-party expert to review these things, and so these are a good faith effort that I took. And the last one is, as I believe, as nonprofit leaders and those who support nonprofits, to remain bold and fearless. This is not a time to cower. This is not a time to withdraw. I think it's our responsibility to maintain and implement your vision, your mission, and your goals that our communities and our country really want and need. One last piece here is that the Constitutional Law Center, if you're interested, we can provide one-on-one counseling, and as Kay mentioned, we conduct governance risk and assessments, compliance for nonprofits. So if you're interested, you can always reach me to discuss. I thank you.
Probably answered a good number of them already. Next, we'll move on to Julien Schopp from Interaction to talk about steps you can take to protect your operations. Hey, Julien?
Yes, hello. Can you hear me?
Hello.
Okay, so this is a presentation on a review that was done of NGOs working internationally and how they perceive risk within their operations. And so we'll review a little bit what the findings were, and hopefully they'll be useful in terms of some best practices that can be taken by different organizations. So the objective of this review that was conducted by Humanitarian Outcomes on, if I can change, yes, here we go. The objective is to look at the current environment, policies and operational responses. So what do organizations working internationally in complex settings perceive as their primary risk, and how do they prioritize and mitigate these risks? The goal of this is really to work with the community of NGOs working internationally to find common solutions to mitigate those risks. So the study had a sample group of 14 international organizations and looked at internal policies and there was a number of specific interviews, 96 key informants, and a survey with more than 400 answers. So it's a pretty comprehensive study that gives a good picture of the situation as it is right now. So first of all, in terms of definitions, threats. What's a threat? So it's really the danger or the potential source of harm or loss. The risk is the likelihood and potential impact of encountering that threat. And the risk management is, of course, the system to forecast and to mitigate for the risk linked to that threat. So this is basically the areas of concern for operational NGOs in the field. You have 6 main areas. And I think what we can say is with time in the past 20 years, 20 years ago you would have 1 or 2 areas that pretty much in isolation would be a risk. I think what we see now in the operating environment of NGOs is that the risks become more and more interlinked. So for instance, the operating environment in terms of security. More and more of NGO workers, aid workers in general, are subject to violence, to crime, and specifically targeted. What has that created in many conflicts and in many operations worldwide? It created much more remote management. So you can see that the link around the security being the security environment being more difficult is operationally going to more and more remote management. For bigger organizations with systems, less and less ears and eyes on the ground to actually follow the programs, ensure compliance. So this remoteness of some activities in many contexts, be it Syria, be it Afghanistan, be it Somalia, be it South Sudan, be it Northeast Nigeria, the biggest humanitarian operations currently, creates this remoteness creates more risk also in terms of fiduciary responsibility, and this is where corruption, fraud, theft, and diversion come up, and also in terms of compliance, because all these activities, as was previously mentioned in the prior presentation, have to comply to international and donor government laws and regulations within their grants, within their parameters, as well as the host government laws, and also as it relates to personnel and HR issues. So all this constellation, to some extent, is much more interlinked and creates more risks for organizations. A new element of this risk perspective is really the information. Information now with social media, with connectivity is much more available to everyone, and is also to some extent much more easily hackable to some extent. So information has become a new area of weakness for organizations where they are looking into ways of strengthening their positioning. Also, it has a consequence in terms of what maybe 20 years ago what you would do in Afghanistan within your programs would remain in Afghanistan. So you would make your pragmatic choices of programming linked to that. But what you would do in terms of implementation in Somalia would be what you would do in Somalia. Now we've seen that that a number of organizations and armed groups where we work and that have territories under their control, do check the internet, do check social media, and actually know what organizations do in different environments. So there is really a necessity to be consistent, coherent, and principled in the programs in that sense. Finally, I think what the study reveals to some extent is that the main fear for all organizations to some extent is reputational. So when, and reputational in the sense that if there is the inability to achieve objectives, if there is corruption, fraud, if there is legal or compliance issues, it all goes back to a reputational risk that damages the image and the reputation of the organization, and to some extent potentially puts its existence under threat. So this is kind of the general constellation that we're looking at. So in terms of the evolving threat, there's an agreement that about the highest risk context, and I've already mentioned them. We all know where they are, and this is where there's a lot of intersections with the previous presentations. And again, these settings involve multiple types of risk, and they're all highly, highly interlinked. And so the nightmare scenario that was brought up by most interviewees is really the major diversion to a terrorist organization. That is seen as the major risk in terms of reputational consequences, and therefore calls for really the need for advocacy on one hand, but also clear due diligence mechanisms to consider. Likewise, on the pure security risk assessment side, the kidnapping is the most prominent threat. So I already mentioned social media and information, new area to consider. In terms of organizational priorities and how to deal with this multifaceted risk, we've seen the larger NGOs really professionalize their approach and try to find ways to manage and to have frameworks to manage this risk much better. What does it mean in terms of policies? It means global risk register tools that allow, according to the 6 areas that we've talked about, to analyze, prioritize, and plan. And linked to that analysis tool, looking at decision-making procedures linked to it, and we'll look at that a little bit afterwards. And then, of course, a follow-up step to see what's the uptake of these frameworks and their success. So clear, regular follow-up and audit processes. And by audit, I don't mean from a financial standpoint necessarily, but really from a more general risk management perspective. In terms of what's existing within organizations, because of the past 20 years, most organizations are more focused on safety and security risk management. And on one side, on the operational side, and the whole fiduciary risk around the financial side, but there still is a lack of overarching policy and tools that can be used. And if you look at the donors right now, the donors are now increasingly emphasizing the fiduciary risk, and especially the prevention, fraud, and diversion aspects. And this is how it's linked to the main reputational risk that's been identified in terms of diversion towards groups that are classified as terrorists. Because of this donor pressure to ensure that this doesn't happen, that this is becoming really the central threat to some extent. And then this is where we arrive at a subject that is close to Charity and Security Network's concerns around the the counterterror requirements that more and more are completely influencing the way that NGOs operate, pushing them for more due diligence, but also to some extent some self-censorship in terms of programming, where they program, how they program, for fear of unknowingly not following the rules and therefore putting their organization at risk. So that leads us to the risk tolerance question. And it's an amusing statistic in the sense that a majority of the people that are interviewed perceive their organization as more risk tolerant than others. So the grass is really greener in that sense in one's own organization. At the same time, the analysis is overarchingly that the sector as a whole is less risk tolerant, and that is seen within this survey and this graph. So the problems and weakness identified. First of all, a very siloed approach. So we have seen the 6 areas. It's still very much conceptually seen as, okay, we need the security analysis to deal with the security risk. We need the fiduciary analysis to deal with that, and there is no overarching system. And then in terms of the pure implementation, there's clear weaknesses in terms of going further afield to some extent. So in the security field, national staff is very, very often not considered enough in terms of the security plans, the security evacuation plans, etc. By the same token, also the whole partnership issue. Donors tend to put the risk to the international organization, who in turn transfers that risk to national partners. And there is not enough mitigation that is done to ensure good partnerships with national partners on the ground when that is happening. And then I think going back to the counter-terror legislation, as we've seen in Somalia a few years back, there is still not clear understanding necessarily from the NGO staff on the ground about what the legislation is and is not, and therefore in doubt, NGO staff and management tends to go towards the safest option, and therefore probably do not do as much as they could or should in terms of reaching people in need. And again, in terms of the donor perceptions of a zero tolerance to corruption, that leaves NGOs without a good option. What does that mean? It means that to some extent management is happy not to know what's really happening, because everyone kind of knows what's happening, but if you want to deliver according to your objectives, the due diligence has to be done, and it could not be done within those circumstances. So there is a don't ask, don't tell side to this in the implementation phase, and that goes back also to the donors that are very much aware in many contexts about the field realities, and therefore don't dig too deep, because they know that they would see things they don't want to see, but they also want to look at the objectives reached. So maybe to finish quickly, a few best practices I think that were analyzed and found that I think could be useful. So first of all, the risk registers as analytical tools that can be used by organizations. So first, to create and maintain a risk register, both at the field and at headquarter level, to really look at what the risks are in what specific context, and then what operational decisions need to be made following those priorities that are identified in the risk register. that allows to mitigate or to correct action. If one risk has been underestimated, what are the mitigating measures to take in that sense? And then, of course, the need to have as many regular visits and audits to look at the implementation of these risk registers and their operationalization. Another promising practice that was found with some organization, that goes back to something identified before, is really having a plan for all the staff. I mean, it seems obvious, but very often in deep field locations, the national staff that work in that specific at that specific town or village, etc., is not encompassed within the general security plan of the organization. So one promising practice was to really have all the national staff within the evacuation plans. When the village, the town was overrun, these staff were moved and evacuated, not to their place of origin, but to a safer location, usually in the capital, or even sometimes in a neighboring country. So really having them as part of the planning. And then looking at the partnership issue and working with partners that potentially I identified as risky, either from a capacity perspective or from a fiduciary perspective, looking at, rather than saying this is a good partner, this is a bad partner, or this is the more risky partners, really looking at specific ways to engage with them, and for instance on a very practical, pragmatic manner in terms of disbursement and funding, going to smaller and more frequent disbursements, minimizing the risk in the way the disbursements are made. And then this is a pretty courageous, from an organizational standpoint, measure, is really cataloging the missteps and what's really not worked, and being very transparent within the whole organization, coming from senior management, and really compiling the list of all significant mistakes or bad outcomes. I think we hear about that in the tech sector and whatnot, but within the humanitarian or aid sector or nonprofit sector, you usually don't want to show our mistakes for fear of upsetting our donors and whatnot. And this being forefront, upfront, and documenting this and being transparent with the organization to really have a learning organization is very important, and a good example to look at. Finally, again, how do we? All these risks are rather complex and involve very technical aspects, be it in the security, be it in the compliance, be it in the operational. So how do we ensure that all the staff are aware of the main pitfalls, the main dangers that exist in terms of operating in such environments? So developing tools and brief, digestible tools, that you can post on the doors, that you can post on the walls, and ensuring really that that's part of the DNA of the organization. So I'll just stop here to leave a little bit of time for questions, but hopefully these last points can be useful to consider for organizations listening.
Okay. Andrea? Okay, there is, you should have a question area in the toolbar on the right of your screen. If you click on the little arrow next to questions, there's a place there where you can list your question. The first one, is it possible to get a copy of these slides? And absolutely yes. These will be posted on our website along with an audio file of the presentations themselves, and that will be up within a matter of days. Are there more questions? While you're thinking about your questions, I would like to thank both speakers for giving us presentations that are so practical in terms of the process of dealing with good governance and operational due diligence. There is no safe harbor. There's no legal checklist of things that you can do, whether they're useful or not, that are going to give you legal protection. This is all now in the era of what's called the risk-based approach, where you really need to look, especially at operations, at your activities, identify the risks that are unique to your mission, your programs, and the context in which you're working, and then that gives you the flexibility to come up with the risk mitigation measures and the risk management plans that you believe are the most effective. And that is a much better process for nonprofits to have than being given a list of due diligence members or measures that has been written by someone buried in the federal bureaucracy who's never been near a nonprofit in their life. So this is the approach that is now being taken, and it has been reinforced by the Financial Action Task Force recommendation on nonprofits, which is requiring all countries, including the U.S., to take a risk-based approach to preventing terrorist abuse of nonprofit organizations. So with that, I'll once again see if there are any questions. Again, you can put in your question on the right-hand side. On your screen, there's the word questions. If you click on the arrow, there's a place where you can type in a question. And a question, how can we contact Shari for further follow-up? I think if you contact Andrew and I, we'll connect you with her. Looking to see if there are additional questions. Okay, without seeing any additional questions, I'm going to assume that we have basically answered them all. I look forward to the future webinars in this series, where we'll continue to bring experts to your notice that can help your organization in this era where we anticipate a less civil society friendly environment, and particularly in the United States. So with that, we'll close here. Thank you all for joining us, and particularly thank you to our speakers for these excellent, very helpful presentations.
Thank you.